Hello again. The word that ties all of our readings together, I believe, is the word longing. Now, if you're joining or if you're watching this other than during the actual service at StMartins Castle on the Zoom platform, I've put the text of the readings in the underneath the YouTube video. But as I said, the word that ties them together is the word longing. I don't know what your longings are, probably for a bit of normality in these strange times, longing to be able to meet together as a congregation or as friends, shaking hands, hugging, doing all the things we would normally do without having to wear face masks and all the rigmarole that we have to do at the moment. We may have longings for our family members, longings for healing, longings for our nation even, and longings for the world, that it would be a better place, a place that would be much more peaceful than it is at the moment. Longings that our political leaders would take climate change seriously and do something about it urgently. All of these things are our longings at the present time. But what about the longings of the people in the stories we've had? Well, the first, of course, was the story about Joseph revealing his identity to his brothers, and it says at the beginning, Joseph could stand it no longer. There were so many people in the room, and he tells all the people, his attendants, to get out to remove themselves so that he could be alone with his brothers, and he reveals who he is, and he wept so loudly the Egyptians could hear him, etc. It's a very moving passage. Joseph, in fact, his character had been formed by his experience of being sold into slavery, being misunderstood, and being cast into prison by his slave owner on false accusations, and then eventually being recognized as the person who could interpret dreams, and so put in charge of the whole program of feeding the nation during a time of famine, which is the circumstances that led Joseph's brothers eventually to come to Egypt to buy grain. Anyway, there's that deep longing that Joseph has, and it is, as I said, it reflects, I think, Jesus Christ himself, who longs. You remember that Jesus longed for Jerusalem to recognize who he was, and he weeps over Jerusalem before he spends his last weekend before he's captured and crucified. So there's a very profound longing, not only in our hearts, but also a longing in the heart of God for us to recognize God. The psalm, with its beautiful words about how pleasant and good it is when brothers and sisters or kindreds live together in unity, it might be a celebration of an experience that is a present experience, or it might be recalling a past experience and longing for that to be restored again. We've got the story then in Matthew of this Gentile woman. She's actually identified as a Canaanite, or in modern day terms would be a Palestinian, who's longing for her daughter to be healed. And Jesus eventually, after appearing to turn her away, in fact, seeming to say something very derogatory to her, I'll come back to that later on, heals her daughter. But we mustn't forget that Jesus himself had a longing for some peace and quiet. He had been very, very busy, and he was probably very tired as well. He felt drained as a human being, and so he had been trying to get away right from when he walked around the top end of the Lake of Galilee to get away from the crowds, and they followed him around. He taught them for the whole day. Then there was that story we had last week about the feeding of the 5,000. And then he walks across the lake. He goes into the hills whilst his disciple row their boat across the lake, and then we have the story of him coming to them on the waters. And this follows on that, and he's still trying to get away from it all with his disciples this time for a quiet retreat, therefore in a Gentile territory in what is today Syria, or maybe part of Lebanon, but I think it's Syria. Anyway, So that's the longing of the Canaanite woman, the longing of Jesus perhaps to have a bit of peace and quiet. And then we get to the whole passage in Romans 11, which actually is part of a much longer passage from the whole of 9 to 11, and we don't understand the longing part of it unless we go back to Romans chapter 10, the first verse, which we read maybe a couple of weeks ago, I can't remember. Dear brothers and sisters, the longing of my heart and my prayer to God is for the people of Israel to be saved. What did Paul mean by being saved, that longing to be saved? Well, saved can be understood narrowly as being delivered out of a bad situation into a good one. In the Jewish context of the day, perhaps the Jews were longing to be set free from the oppression of the occupation, the Roman occupation. But in fact, more broadly, to be saved is to bring out into a spacious place. That's what the word originally meant. It is to set us free from our limitations. It is to be delivered from factors that limit our freedom to be fully human. And that is what Paul was longing for his people. His longing was grounded in his own experience, and it grew out of that assurance about God's love for him, which he had experienced through Jesus Christ. And these chapters, as a whole, deal with questions which we may have about the way in which God is working in our own situation at our own time, as we long for God to work, maybe through us. In these chapters, of course, Paul is actually unpacking something that he said right at the introduction of his letter, in chapter 1, verse 16 and 17, where he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the saving power of God for everyone who has faith, the Jew first, and then the Gentiles. He's already expanded on other aspects of his introductory statement, but in these chapters he picks up and expands on that phrase, the Jew first, and then the Gentiles. Historically, of course, the Jews were the first to hear the good news of Jesus Christ, the good news about the kingdom of God that Jesus preached. And it was clear from his mission that Jesus' mission was actually to the Jewish people and not the Gentiles, which, as I said, might explain, though it doesn't necessarily excuse, his rather brusque and derogatory initial response to the Canaanite woman. But the plan was that the Jews who first believed would have been the evangelists to spread this good news to the non-Jewish world. In the event, most Jews, especially the religious hierarchy and institutional Judaism, rejected the good news, and it is this that pains Paul most. Well, I can't go into the details of the arguments here, but suffice it to say that in chapter 9, Paul argues that God has the right to choose whoever he wants to be the instruments of his purpose, often choosing the least likely candidate. How strange of God to choose the Jews, some have said. Well, we remember the story of Jacob that we've been reading recently in the Old Testament, and how Jacob was certainly an unlikely candidate to be the first, to be the one that God would choose. Throughout this section, of course, Paul is not thinking so much about the way in which God saves the individual as the way in which God uses nations as well as individuals, believers as well as unbelievers, people who have failed as well as people who have succeeded, in order to fulfill his purpose. In chapter 10, he argues that we humans have a responsibility to respond, so we can't blame God for the outcomes of our unwise or wrong choices. And in chapter 11, Paul finally expands on how he sees God fulfilling his plan to the Jews first and then to the Gentiles. He begins with this question, has God rejected his people? Because it seems that they have rejected God, or rather the good news. By no means. He says, I myself am an Israelite, so a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. And I'm therefore an example of the fact that God hasn't rejected his people. And then he says this key phrase, God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. It is often badly translated as chosen beforehand. not predestined. That's not what it's all about. Foreknowing is to know all about, to know the fact that we fail, we have that potential of failing, to know that we are fallible human beings, but to know also what we need to learn and to know and to believe and to have faith in. And that is that deep down we have that divine nature, that Christ-like nature, longing to be brought out and expressed. So the central point remains, though, that Paul's longing that his own people will be saved along with every nation of the world. But does that mean that they have to become Christians, though? Again, the key question is, what does it mean to be saved? How are we saved? Is it by believing the right things, or, as I believe, by having the same faith as Jesus did? So righteousness, which means being reconnected with our true divine nature and with God, who is the source of our being, is a process. Paul says at the beginning, in the passage we just read quoted from the beginning, it starts from faith and ends in faith. It starts with the faithfulness of Jesus Christ and ends in our faithfulness or our faith. It starts with the faith of Jesus Christ and ends with us having the same faith. Now, Paul has made this point clear in chapter 3, verse 22, a verse which I think is often mistranslated. The righteousness, or God's righteousness, is given not, as is often translated, through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe, but through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ to all who have faith, which is what the Greek actually says. It is also having the same faith as Jesus had that sets us free from our narrow ego identities, including our narrow religious identities, to live as complete, fulfilled human beings like Jesus. He concludes this section by saying, "For God has imprisoned all in disobedience, so that he may be merciful to all." What does he mean by that? Well, basically, to achieve his longing to have mercy on all, God seems to have adjusted his strategy to take in account of even our disobedience. And that is the conclusion that Paul comes to in this passage. And it may well be this intention to have this, his intention rather, to have this stand as the climax, the summation of his entire discussion of the gospel, which he wanted to share with the church in Rome, in order, incidentally, that they might support him on his intended mission to Spain. So mercy is God's response to disobedient Israel, as it has been God's response to disobedient Gentiles, including us. It may be a strange way of going about saving the world, but this is actually the climax of the book, which is why he follows this passage with a doxology we didn't read, but I'm going to read it now. In conclusion, "Oh, how great are God's riches and wisdom and knowledge! How impossible it is for us to understand his decisions and his ways. For who can know the Lord's thoughts? Who knows enough to give him advice? And who has given him so much that he needs to pay it back? For everything comes from him and exists by his power and is intended for his glory. All glory to him forever. Amen."